My name is Janet Hauser, and I'm incredibly proud to be serving as the board chair of the Colorado Health Foundation. Unfortunately, I'm unable to join you in person today due to a tremendous opportunity I've been given as provost at Regis University. During this symposium, I'll be in Africa to recognize and award graduation diplomas to students who have completed coursework in refugee camps. Having made this trip before, I know I'll find myself in communities and refugee camps where the idea of a permanent home is nothing but a dream. I will no doubt be struck by the experience of both the tremendous assets that a community brings, but also an egregious lack of shelter. Indeed, the critical role that housing plays in our lives is certainly global. While I will be far away from all of you, rest assured I will be reminded in every moment why every person and family deserves a safe place to call home. I'd like to briefly recognize the board by asking them each to stand and acknowledge them as my colleagues in helping to support the great work of the Colorado Health Foundation. It has been an honor to serve next to them the past 9 years. Like me, in those years, many of you may have noticed that the foundation has evolved in the past decade. One of the most important aspects of that evolution, to me, is the broader view of health we've taken. It's a view that includes the most important hallmarks of living a healthy life, including a safe place to call home. The role that safe, affordable housing plays in our health is considerable. I'm fortunate to be here in New Freedom Park in Denver. This is a vibrant, safe, and cherished common ground for the local multinational refugee community who are putting down roots here. Public housing is home for this community, whose energy and passion inspired and enabled this local gem of a park where kids play safely and families grow healthy food. It's taken decades for us to recognize how housing can promote good health, mental and physical. Further research clearly shows that unsafe and unaffordable housing prevents health from being in reach, and there are countless connections between housing and other drivers of health, including educational attainment and economic security. Colorado is in a housing crisis from Metro Denver to the most rural parts of our state. We will not be successful in achieving health equity for Coloradans unless this crisis is addressed. That's why we designed this year's symposium as an opportunity to explore what it means for every Coloradan to have a roof over their head. There is much more power in the intersection of all that each of you have to offer. Today and tomorrow, I hope everyone is able to both learn together and connect, especially for those of you who may not view each other as traditional partners. I wish each of you a productive and meaningful rest of the conference, and I look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you.
Good morning. So I'd like to have my board members stand up again with the lights really on, and let's say thank you to them. Let me say thank you to them. I have an awesome board. You know they have to be pretty awesome to not just put up with, but support my shenanigans. So thank you very much. So I don't know about you, but I had a great day yesterday. I was inspired, I was provoked, I was emotional, I was mad, I was inspired. And I think what I took away most from yesterday was, I guess it's a reaffirmation that there are people across the age spectrum, across the political spectrum, across socioeconomic, the gender spectrum, who are hungry to have these conversations and are willing to have them respectfully with each other. And we've got to figure out how do we mobilize that and do that all across the state. Now, this is a point where all my staff now are holding their breath because they're not sure what's about to come out of my mouth, but they know whatever it is means work for them. There's a role, I know there's a role for the foundation to play in facilitating these conversations across the state. I don't know exactly what that role is yet, but I know there's some role, there's an important role we can play in bringing together groups of people who, as Janet said, wouldn't view each other as traditional partners. But if we actually sat down and talked together, we'd figure out, you know, we may have 14 things we don't agree on, but this one thing that really upsets us, that we want to change, we could get together on that one thing. So I've got to think about it. I'm happy to be a resource to any of you that want to think more about it, but I would like to see this, us not just have it contained in this space. How do we expand it to the space that is Colorado? So that's what I took away from yesterday. I'm just as excited about the rest of the day. I'll talk to you in a moment about the rest of today. But as I said yesterday, we have a special announcement to make today about a new experiment we're going to undertake. And the new experiment is that we're going to start sponsoring a nonprofit sabbatical program. So why would we do that? Several reasons. One, we want to reward and recognize people who have been soldiers, warriors for years in this fight for equity, in this fight for bringing justice and dignity to low-income and marginalized Coloradans. We want to reward and recognize them, give them a chance to rejuvenate, renew, reflect, and be ready to come back and hit the ground and stay in. So we want to try to ebb the tide of burnout and people leaving the field. We also want to help build the bench for future leadership because while those people are on their sabbatical, someone else in the organization is going to step up and take on that leadership role. And there are opportunities for people to experience, is this the track I want to be on? And sometimes the answer is no, I like being second in command. But there are lessons and opportunities and leadership challenges that you can only get from being in that seat. And so this will give someone in the organization or a couple of people in the organization a chance to experience what it's like, and that'll help us build the strength. And if nothing else, it builds the capacity of that organization. And then we also want to focus on capacity building of that organization. So it's organizational capacity building, individual leadership development for the future, and time to reflect, renew, and come back for the current leadership. So this is right now, what we're thinking it looks like. So the award recipients, there will be a grant made to their organization that will include 3 to 4 months of salary and benefits for that person. The reason 3 to 4 months, you can either take a 3-month sabbatical or a 4-month sabbatical. That's between you and your board. The grant will also include funding to give extra salary to the person that's going to step up into the leadership role, and it will include money for your organization to use for its capacity building. So you can decide as an organization how you want to use that. Plus, you will have the savings from the salary and benefits that you can also use if you want for capacity building or technical assistance or replacing the laptops or whatever you want to do. It will also include a $20,000 stipend for the award recipient to spend however they want on their sabbatical. So if you want to go climb Kilimanjaro, if you want to go to Bali and become a yoga master, if you want to just travel the country and visit all your relatives you haven't seen, so however you want to spend the money. It doesn't have to be related to your job. It's what will require for you to renew yourself. Now there is one little catch. One of those months of your 3 or 4 month sabbatical, we want you at the foundation as an executive in residence. We want to learn from you. And hopefully, what we can offer you is we can lift the veil on philanthropy. You can come in and help us be better. And hopefully we can offer you some insight into our world and into some of the expertise that we have and some of the networks that we have. And once the award is made, because these things take a lot of planning, you still have 18 months from the date of the award to start your sabbatical, because these are things that have to be timed right with your organization, with your family, with your personal circumstance. And then we're going to start with doing 2 awards annually. We'd love to work it up to like 5 or 6 a year, but we need to start with just a couple till we work out the kinks. So does that sound good? So I have a request of you, because we've done a lot of thinking about it. We've talked to other foundations who offer nonprofit sabbaticals. We've kind of thought about things, but I'm hoping there are a group of 20 or 25 of you who are currently executive directors of nonprofits who will join me for lunch as a focus group. Because we want to be informed by the community we hope to serve. In this instance, the community are nonprofit executives. So we want to sit with you, or I want you to sit with me. And all I want to hear is, what questions do you have after just hearing this? What thoughts did you have? Because before we roll this out in the fall for the application phase, we'll give people about 5 months, 5 months to complete the application, because it's not a small thing to do. But what are you thinking so that we can make sure we've tried to capture and think of and plan for the things that would matter to you? So we want to make sure we've covered all our bases. And so I'm hoping a group of 20 and 25 of you will be willing to join me for lunch as a focus group. And I would appreciate that. So we're excited, I'm excited. The 1 month sabbatical, the 1 month as an executive in residence at the foundation, the executive and I will personally work out, we'll personally figure out how you want to spend your time at the foundation. And, there's no meeting that you can't go to. We'll figure all that out. Okay. Don't forget the app. If you don't have it yet, get it. And then today, so I don't want to spend a lot of time up here because I want us to get to the day's agenda. So we've got another great day. We've got some panel of journalists this morning. I want to talk about the role of journalism in this work. We actually are going to get a sneak preview. I'm so excited about this. You're going to get a sneak preview of a report that's not even released yet. A report that's being released, that's been written by CHI, the Colorado Health Institute, but that was, what's the word? That was asked for, that's not the right word, but that was asked for by the Health Equity Advocacy Cohort from the Colorado Trust. They've taken a statewide view of health and housing and they're going to share some of those data and what some of their findings, and then they will also participate in a panel that follows that. And the report, as I said, isn't even released. I think it gets released at the end of the month. So you're the first to get a sneak preview of it. We will certainly make sure you get access to it once it's released. So we're very excited to be able to have that this morning. And then we'll take an early lunch break, and then we'll come back for Matthew Desmond, that I know a lot of you know of his work and are looking forward to hearing from him. So it's going to be a great morning. Again, the afternoon of exchange sessions, and then there's African dance and yoga and hiking before our dinner hour. And then, of course, the ever-popular dance party. I have 2 knee braces that I'll be wearing tonight, so I can dance the night away and not worry about it. So I'm excited again for the day. Thank you all for your positive comments and energy from yesterday. And so now I just want to introduce our moderator for the morning, Michael Booth. Michael is a health communications consultant, journalist, and he spent 30 years reporting on advocacy, writing about advocacy and community issues across Colorado. So, Michael, thank you all.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to the foundation and all the organizers for this chance to broaden the conversation between journalists and the people who are working hard on addressing all of these issues that have been raised about the social determinants of health, and in particular, housing and its relation to all of the social determinants of health that we'll be talking about today. Remember that you don't have to start filling out your sabbatical applications right now. If you could hold that off till later. There's a session at 11:30 with Karen to talk about that, but I know it's a huge, exciting opportunity. Why do we want to talk more with journalists today about the social determinants of health and the housing issues in Colorado? That came up a lot yesterday in terms of why it's necessary. There are facts and then there are stories, and they're both hugely important in getting this point across and in getting change to happen. One of the things I really appreciated about yesterday's conversations was it talked about, we know that change needs to happen, and here are the problems. How do we get change to happen? The way you get change to happen is you talk to the policymakers who can make the change happen. You can talk to legislatures who can bring in new laws, city council members. You also need to talk to voters who are going to approve or disapprove a tax increase for affordable housing, or a latest school bonding issue that makes a school district more livable for the people who are looking for housing in those districts. And the people who are going to be telling those stories and synthesizing those facts, going out in the community, talking to every different community, and learning what the issues are and listening, are the journalists who are with us today and the journalists who are working every day throughout Colorado. So that was the idea in bringing them here today. And for you to talk to them and bring in your questions about how they can do their job better, what you can do to help them, what you can bring to the table with them in terms of facts and figures and stories. I wanted to start with 2 very quick stories today that I've found in my reporting that talk about, yesterday there was a lot of talk about the mechanisms. It's one thing to just sort of show up and say, wow, these people are in a bad situation. It's another to observe, as Marissa did and Matt Iglesias did and a lot of other panelists yesterday, to say, what are the mechanisms that official decisions were made and institutional decisions were made to take things away from people or put them in that position. I want to share the story of Andrea Fuller's family, who have lived in a Denver apartment building, a very modest Denver apartment complex, for 11 years. We've talked about the idea of a house is not just a house, it needs to be a home. One of the things that makes a house a home is safety and a safe environment. And they wanted to move to another apartment in the same complex because garbage wasn't getting picked up in their part of the complex. There were other issues with their own apartment. When they applied to move to a new apartment, they were asked to pay a new deposit, even though they've been paying rent at this place for 11 years. They were asked to pay a transaction fee, which they still don't understand what the transaction fee is. They are asked to pay a paperwork fee. The total of all these fees was going to be more than $1,100. And we have talked, a lot of the people in this group have reported about the fact that 40% of Americans don't even have $400 in an emergency fund to pay for contingencies like that. They are being asked to pay $1,100 just to transfer to a place they'd already been paying rent to for 11 years. When they got to their new apartment finally, they found that there were no batteries in the smoke detectors. The washing machine didn't work for the first 7 weeks that they lived there. Oh, and the heat didn't work either. So there was no heat in their apartment. So that's the kind of official institutional decisions that are made for them by the apartment owners that have been changed, thankfully, this year by some new legislation that requires that apartments provide a safer environment, that landlords have more responsibility, and that renters have more access to change that situation. But it's a very difficult thing to do. They felt they had no power in this situation. And I want to bring up another family we've talked about. Trailer parks get a bad name. They're the butt of a lot of jokes by journalists, by policymakers, by late night talk show hosts. But there's another term for trailer parks. It's called affordable housing. And we talked to a family who has been living in Denver Meadows. They had moved here from Missouri, Shannon Holloman's family. They were paying $500 rent. I don't know if you know how trailer parks work, but usually you own your actual trailer, your home, and then you pay rent on the spot to have the spot hook it up to water and other utilities. So she was paying $500 for her family in Missouri, not quite as hot a housing market. When they moved to Denver Meadows, they were asked to pay $890 for their parking spot, which was a big stretch for them because they don't have the highest paying jobs in the world, but they can make it work. Then the owner of the trailer park let people know, after things have been deteriorating for quite a while in terms of conditions, that the place is going to be redeveloped into apartment buildings, golf course, who knows, whatever the demand was for. And so they all had to get out. They all had to leave. She looked around for her family, and the cheapest pad that she could get to park their home anywhere else in the Denver metro area was $1,300. Another huge stretch for their family. They could have moved to Grand Junction to find a cheaper place, but then what's the job? Job market is not quite as hot in Grand Junction, and they weren't sure they were going to be able to get the job that would then pay the cheaper rent there. So they were just faced with this decision that they were going to have to leave and didn't really know what they were going to do about it. And this is in the city of Aurora, where their own housing reports show that they're among families that are making $25,000 a year or less. There's a deficit in Aurora alone of 14,000 affordable housing units. And all over the metro area, trailer parks are getting zoned out or developers are redeveloping them. And policymakers and local city council people have finally realized that maybe they need to do some support for mobile home communities, in building co-ops, creating alternatives for people to stay there instead of having all be redeveloped and get out of the way. And it's a positive development, but it's another way to think about affordable housing and needs to be reported on more. The Aurora City Council person who was trying to help them is herself Hispanic, first-generation college graduate who had grown up in a lot of rental housing throughout East Denver and Western Aurora, and had had to move a lot for different reasons, facing rent increases. And she just said that in working on situations like this and other constituents, that she's still facing thousands of people every month who are facing the choice between rent and food. And the way she put it was, I can't believe that as a developed country, we're still having this conversation. But we're having this conversation every day, as we proved yesterday and will prove throughout today. Now, to talk a little bit about some national statistics that can put this in perspective. Not sure if you guys have the slides that are working for those, but we had some numbers to both go in the national situation and the Colorado situation. If not, we can go straight to the panel. How's it looking, Sarah? 1 second. Great. These are different slides. That's okay. Let's have the panel come up here and we'll start talking some individual questions. We can run the slides later. Today with us we have Tina Griego from the Colorado Independent. Tina, come on up. Allison Bektesh from Aspen, who has done reporting up there for the papers and also moderated panels for Aspen Public Radio about public housing in particular and people's housing issues. Mark Ian is with Kaiser Health News as a new addition to the Colorado scene and have done a lot of reporting in Oregon on the social determinants of health and health in general. And he's going to be working for Kaiser Health News, which now has a bureau in Denver, in case you guys hadn't heard that is being funded by local foundations, including the Health Foundation. So, some welcome new firepower on the local health scene. Jacob Rogers from the Gazette in Colorado Springs, who reports on civic issues there and as they especially relate to housing issues and has worked on some interesting issues with a recent housing project there. And Ruben Gallardo, who is joining us from some work he's done with Out Front. And Out Front is one of the leading gay and lesbian publications in Colorado working on those specific issues, and he's done some interesting reporting recently on housing issues among that community. So welcome all of you. And just to go with the format for a minute, we're going to talk for about half an hour amongst ourselves. Then with your input, we have index cards on the tables, as we always do. The veterans here know how this works. Write down your questions, your comments, things you'd like people to address. If you have a specific person you'd like to address it, that's great. And pass those down to the end of your table. People will come around, grab those questions and sort through them. People who are watching on the live stream can please add your comments to the live stream on YouTube or send in your questions by Twitter and people will bring them up and we'll get those in the last 15 minutes. So I wanted to start with Tina. Tina, you've spent a lot of time in Sun Valley, among other Colorado communities, writing about issues such as gentrification, the city's involvement in changes that are going on in Sun Valley for better and for worse, and whether residents felt that was for better or worse. Love for you to introduce to this group, not all of whom are from Denver, about what Sun Valley's place is in the metro community and what its place is in the Hispanic community, and what's been going on there in the last 10 years in terms of trying to change that community and how people who've lived there a long time feel about it.
And how much time do I have?
Minute and a half.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, very excited. It's a little bit like being a kid in a candy store to be in this room because I look out at all of these faces and all of this expertise and passion and devotion, and I see stories. So thank you for having me here. So Sun Valley is located south of the Bronco Stadium. That's probably the most notable marker of it. It's past that vast ocean of parking lots. It is in a natural kind of gully. And back when it was established in the late 70s, the Platte River was basically a sewage line. It was behind the railroad tracks, so you had tracks, Platte, Xcel Energy had, and still does, tanks, big giant tanks there. And so, and then on the west side of it was Federal Boulevard, which rises high. So if you're on Federal, there's a line of buildings there. You actually can't see into Sun Valley. It has natural and man-made barriers. On the south is an industrial belt. It was once a Jewish neighborhood, and then as people became economically more sufficient, they started moving up the hill into Colfax, into West Colfax. When I started working on Sun Valley, I actually really didn't even know whether I should call it a neighborhood because it's really a kind of government construction. It's almost all public housing. There's about 1,200 residents there. Depends if you're using the official count, which is always an undercount, or how many people are kind of moving in and out of Sun Valley. I want to say it's already been 7 or 8 years back, the city has been talking about what are we going to do with this concentrated generational poverty that exists in Sun Valley. And it had models from other developments it did around the city. So basically the model is to do mixed income development there. And they've raised the first units, and people were allowed to relocate within Sun Valley or to take a Section 8 voucher and move to another unit. The idea is to minimize displacement. Those public housing units, the count, which is around 330, they will stay there, but the neighborhood is going to triple in density as they bring in mixed income. It is a very deliberate, intentional plan to try to change a neighborhood, to bring mixed income into the neighborhood without displacement, to give people who live there a say in what this place will be, what this community will be, to benefit from the changes, to give them work, to actually create something that I don't really think exists in Denver anymore. Mariposa, which is across the railroad tracks, is very close. But one thing that Mariposa did is that when they put that investment in there, it changed the neighborhood around. It helped speed the gentrification around that redevelopment, which is also mixed income. That's changing for Sun Valley.
So Tina, in terms of the city helping with Sun Valley or other institutions, one issue has been, do they come in and say, you have problems and we're going to fix it? Or do they come in and say, what do we want this neighborhood to look like? What do you want this neighborhood to look like? What are the challenges that you face? And how can we help you address it in the way that you want to? I'm just curious whether the institutional approach was any better than it has been for the last 50 years.
I actually think it was.
Okay.
So I was there for a lot of those conversations. I spent about 2 months in Sun Valley writing this story, in which there was very deliberate attempts by the Housing Authority, by various foundations, to kind of come in and to bring the community together. This is a very difficult community to organize for a number of reasons. One is there is a historical and not undeserved distrust of government. And so anything that the city comes in and says, this is going to be better, they're going to say, for whom? Because I'm not sure this is going to be for me. I face the same distress going in too. And so, I'm sorry, that was one reason. The second reason is Sun Valley is almost all kids. And so besides the children, there are adults, and then there's a constant churn. So you have people who are leaving and coming and leaving and coming, and it's very difficult to get people on the same page. But there were numerous attempts and meetings over the years, and they continue, and there's some changes that have happened, to try to ensure that the people who live in Sun Valley through the years, again, because the population changes, have a say in what Sun Valley becomes.
So let's talk about the reporting aspect of that quickly before I move to another person. Was it hard to get people to share their stories with you and share their emotions with you and gain their trust so that you could, and then who did you feel you were trying to communicate that message to in your reporting?
Yes, it was very hard. Something Karen said last night after the film and that very intense, profound discussion that happened after the film, she talked about the idea of going to activate community voices. At the Colorado Independent, which is a nonprofit, we talk about amplifying voices. In that we have to be careful how we say that so that the burden is not on the community, that those voices have always been there, and that there have been systems of exclusion, and those systems of exclusion have to be called on the carpet. The media is one of those. We have been part of the problem. We have been gatekeepers. And so when I go in there, I'm actually seen, when I first went there, I'm actually seen as an arm of government. And they see no reason to talk to me. And also, there has been a historic propensity by outsiders, including the media, to define communities like Sun Valley by their deficits. And no community wants to be defined solely by its deficits. there is a blindness to the assets that exist there. And so I had to go in and talk. Well, basically what I had to do is actually go in and listen. Let me correct myself. I had to go in and listen, and listen, and listen, and listen. And I went to a lot of meetings, I knocked on a lot of doors, and eventually I became a little bit of a fixture around there, and that's how I started to gain access and trust and such.
And that's a great point, that journalists see themselves as fighting the man, in quotes. We're there for the people, and don't realize that when we walk into situations of people who have different experiences, we are the institution. We have a big publication, we have a big staff, we come from certain educational backgrounds, and we're a lot more like the government institutions that are suppressing them or not addressing their needs than we are like them.
That's
so
correct.
It's important to remember. Jacob, if you could talk a little bit about some reporting you've done recently. There's a new housing development in Colorado Springs that you've written about that is aimed at a specific population that's had difficulty in finding housing, let alone a home. Talk a little bit about what you've been working on there.
Yeah, so down in Colorado Springs, there's a nonprofit down there. They've been really working for the past several years to improve a lot of the foundational sort of services that are available for people who are experiencing homelessness. The Springs is pretty behind the times in terms of support for the homeless population. About 20 years ago, a project that would have really boosted shelter just really faltered amid a lot of community backlash against it and resistance. So it's only been in the last 5 or 6 years that we've really seen, again, a concerted push to improve just even baseline shelter. And so they've really been building a lot of shelter, and they've created a big campus, much in the same vein of like San Antonio, Phoenix, that sort of thing. And while they were building that campus, they decided to build a apartment complex. What they did is they applied for low-income housing tax credits, so they got the 9% funding model out of that, and they built a 65-unit building that just opened up. They've been replacing residents for the last 3-4 weeks, and so I was able to have a chance to talk to a lot of the residents in there. What it is, essentially this is a pretty much a completely permanent supportive housing building. Every person in there receives a housing voucher, a federal housing voucher, and which includes a lot of wraparound services. They all get a case manager. They all get access to medical care, to mental health care, to substance abuse treatment, better access to VA help, DHS, even just the simple task of trying to get an ID for a lot of people who are living on the streets is monumental. And when they get an ID, usually it's stolen within a week or so. So it's what it's intended to do is essentially kind of continue that housing first ethos that we've seen many other places across the nation. Colorado Springs has been, again, a little bit behind the times in terms of building that out. We've already had several vouchers and a program like that in the Springs, but this is the first major expansion of that we've seen in quite a while there.
What did you feel were your challenges in understanding the group that you were talking to, their individual challenges, but then also talk a little bit about who did you feel your audience was? Who were you trying to tell about this aspect of homelessness and housing challenges?
Yeah, good question. So basically, for the first part of that, trying to get the stories of the people who are living there, I've been fortunate. I've been able to cover this area for the past 6 years or so. So I've already spent a lot of time, walking in the camps and at the shelters, trying to meet as many people as I can. And so I already have a bit of a rapport with many of the folks who have been homeless for many years. I think the biggest thing though is that it's really fascinating how so often people who are homeless want to actually just tell their stories. I think there's kind of a hesitancy amongst many of the nonprofit leaders that I talk to kind of protect the people who they're serving, which is natural, and oftentimes it's I understand. But I think that more often than not, usually I just say, hey, how's it going? Shake your hand and start talking, and they'll just start gushing. Sometimes it takes a few questions to start getting going, but they've been ostracized by society for so long that when someone actually takes an interest in their story, they want it to be told, which is cool.
Are there gaps between what your readership thinks they know about what brings people to homelessness and what addiction problems are, what these questions of racial inequity in housing versus what conversations you actually have with people who have experienced homelessness.
Yeah, definitely. I think. The whole model of providing housing first, and then, once you after providing that stabilization, that foundation, then addressing getting a job, treating an addiction, that sort of thing. I think there's still quite a bit of hesitancy, a lot of skepticism and resistance in the community about that. And so, basically, in writing a story like that, I didn't even get really into the whole LIHTC financing model, which is, brain damage to begin with, but essentially just trying to offer more of the human perspective was the goal with that. And I think that that's oftentimes in trying to cover homelessness, that's what I think is most important, is trying to offer the human stories of what's actually happening, so that people can actually see a lot of times they aren't that far away themselves from homelessness, or they see a relative who could very well be in that same situation. Because I think, that there's still quite a bit of a gap there in that understanding. Yeah.
Ruben, if we could talk, do you have the microphone there? Great. A little bit about your reporting recently for Out Front about another specific group, and some of even though they're a group, they all bring their individual stories to the situation they found themselves in. But talk a bit about the housing issues that face lesbian and gay community in Colorado, and where you see that going for them in terms of public understanding and the role that you can play in telling people about that.
Right. So first, I would like to talk about my inspiration to decide to pursue this topic. So back in the fall, I was listening to a podcast, and it kind of gave a general overview of the housing crisis. And one of the guests, they briefly mentioned that LGBTQ individuals are usually disproportionately affected by the housing crisis, and this has to do with the rampant discrimination that still occurs in the home and outside of the home. So that's when I decided to pursue the topic and see how it's affecting people, especially in the Denver metro area. So for my article that I wrote, I talked to 3 organizations that are providing services to these individuals in the Denver metro area, and this includes the Gathering Place, which is a daytime drop-in center for unaccompanied women and transgender folks, the Dolores Project, which is a shelter, and they also provide supportive housing for unaccompanied women and transgender folks. And finally, I spoke to Urban Peak, which I believe there's a representative here in this conference who will be speaking in some event later. And they provide services to youth ages 15 and 25 in the Denver metro area. And when I was speaking to the directors of these organizations, I found the reasons why young people, especially LGBTQ individuals, are most affected by the housing crisis. So when I was speaking to Christina Carlson at Urban Peak, she mentioned that there's 3 major predictors for youth who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. The first predictor is family instability, followed by involvement in the juvenile system and the welfare system, and that's usually referring to the foster care system. And finally, the third major indicator, predictor, it's individuals that self-identify as LGBTQ. And once I kind of heard these stories from these directors and from my own research, I also found some interesting statistics. And based on the research that is being done out there by organizations that are trying to address these problems, they estimate that about 7% of the general youth population in the US identifies as LGBTQ. However, about 40% of the youth population experiencing homelessness in the US identifies as LGBTQ. So these major predictors and statistics just kind of tell you how this marginalized community is usually more affected by the housing crisis. And the reasons for that is it usually has to do with family conflicts. So one of the most common factors that is cited out there by individuals who have experienced homelessness in their younger years is that when they come out to their families, they may not be accepted by their parents, or whoever they're living with. And this can create a hostile environment in the home. And worst case scenario for them, they may be kicked out of their homes because their parents or their family doesn't accept them for who they are. And in addition to that, even if they're not kicked out of their homes, they make the tension between them and their family may create such a hostile environment that it forces them to run away. So this is the reason why we're seeing those statistics out there. And
there's another group, even when you are of age, there's another group that is rejected by apartment owners or apartment managers who just, whether overtly or just by never giving a reason why they're rejecting the application, make it clear that they don't want people from that community living in their apartment.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring that up because right now in the US, it's still not explicitly prohibited to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So right now, there's about 5.6 million adults that ages 18 and older in the US that identify as LGBTQ who live in states without explicit statutory protections against discrimination in housing. In addition to that, there's some great research out there being done by the Williams Institute, which is a think tank at UCLA Law School. And they recently conducted a survey back in November 2018 where 15% of the LGBTQ people who responded said that they were denied housing. And in comparison, only 6% of their heterosexual peers were denied housing for whatever reason. So the fact that it's still not illegal to discriminate against sexual orientation and gender identity, even though we have gay marriage, doesn't mean that these individuals are facing further obstacles when it comes to housing and when it comes to, kind of being involved in the economic spectrum.
We can certainly imagine people giving talks at the conference 10 or 20 years from now, looking back, and it feeling like people's reaction to Marissa's conversation yesterday about ethnic discrimination, racial discrimination, and what that felt like, and hoping that between now and then there's more protection available and the practices are different. I hope that people are prompted to ask some more questions about that. Allison, I wanted to get to another part of the state geographically. People's assumption is it's a different part of the state economically as well, but there are huge economic challenges in Pitkin County and in the mountain communities in terms of housing, and you've covered them quite a bit. I'd like to hear a little bit about what you've been working on lately in terms of affordable housing challenges and just trying to find, there are a lot of $20 million houses in Aspen. There are also a lot of people who are working there for minimum wage or just above to do all the service work for people who are living in the $20 million houses. So tell us about those conflicts and what's going on right now in terms of trying to solve them.
Certainly. I want to start by echoing Tina and say that I'm thrilled about who's in the room. I do cover housing in Aspen, which is to say I'm a general assignment reporter. There's nothing that touches our community that doesn't come back to housing. I also produce the radio series leading up to the Aspen Ideas Health program every year, which is global health. So I don't know if I'm more excited to talk to you guys about health or housing, but the intersection is absolutely real. So I did some research real quick on Zillow this week. The cheapest thing on the market in the Aspen area in Pitkin County is $115,000, which is pretty reasonable if you're trying to buy a house in Indiana. In Aspen, that's for 20 days of a hotel room a year. If you want to live in Aspen year-round, the cheapest thing that I found on the market is $250,000. That is a 300 square foot hotel room. And I saw the statistics, Denver metro area, I believe Colorado in general, that it would take about someone earning the median wage 20 years of saving, if you're putting 5% of your wages away, in order to buy a house. So that's not going to be $250,000 20 years from now. That's going to be exponentially bigger, of course. Our median home price is $2.5 million, which for math purposes was very easy for me to then do the calculation. If you are earning 50 grand a year in Aspen and want to buy in the free market, it'll take you 200 years to save up. About 5 years ago, when I first started reporting in Aspen, there was a story that a member of our homeless population won $250,000 on a scratch-off lotto ticket. This was national news because he couldn't buy a house in Aspen. And I know that that's the reputation. But I think because we're kind of at that extreme, almost comical level, we can have these conversations a little less personally that are happening with anyone else, right? Because what people said to him is, why don't you leave? What people say to our accountants and our lawyers who can't afford to live in Aspen is, why don't you leave? And that's the same conversation that happens to a homeless population anywhere, right? Like, you're living in Colorado, we have winters, you're sleeping on the streets, why don't you just go? Why don't we just bus you somewhere else? And so it doesn't really matter, we're all human. It doesn't matter if you're working at a nonprofit in Aspen or if you're sleeping on the streets in Aspen. The first question of why don't you leave is insulting on a human level, of course.
And I think this was from one of your pieces that 30% of the year-round residents in Aspen are living in supported housing, are they not? Or price-limited housing?
So I'm going to do my best to not make fun of Aspen, since I'm the one representing Aspen today, because we do have the oldest affordable housing program in resort communities. It's the largest per capita in the nation. So there's a lot of things that Pitkin County got right and early, which is allowing us to house our workforce population. Because we started early, we didn't have a roadmap. There's a lot of things that we got wrong, and so hopefully people can learn as well. We have about 3,300 beds in Aspen that are subsidized by the government. We have a year-round population a little bit more than 7,000. So that is a significant portion of the people who live in Aspen who are not paying free market to either rent or own their home. The conversation that's come up is community housing versus workforce housing. Of those 3,500 beds, they're not all working in Aspen. Some are retired, some are children, some had a family. They're not even all occupied. Some had a family and got a 3-bedroom house because the people who made the affordable housing system 40 years ago wanted houses, and they built themselves houses. They moved into those houses. They raised their kids in those houses. Those kids have left. Those beds are empty. We have no requirements for those people to move out of their home, and should we? Of course, like, you worked your whole life in Aspen. You can't tell someone to move once you're not work eligible. Right. And there's a lot of that kind of conversation, I think, of, in my mind, what I call indentured servitude. If your employer is your landlord, it becomes a very difficult conversation.
Is there an ethnic or racial component to some of the conversations, in that the stereotype or the perception is that people doing a lot of the work involved in housekeeping and cleaning and road work and roofing, things like that, are maybe Hispanic or another ethnicity, and that they need more support and they have to live 2 counties away? Does that come into play in Pitkin County?
Yeah, absolutely. We're 94% white in Pitkin County. It's outrageous. Almost everyone who works in Pitkin County or works in Aspen buses in general, though. Okay. So almost your entire workforce. I told you we're maybe sleeping about 40% of our population. We are housing closer to 30% of our workforce, right? Okay. So 70% of the daily workforce is coming in from the rest of the communities in the Roaring Fork Valley. I think we very much feel like we're all one valley because of that. But yeah, if you are taking a bus, I lived in the Mid-Valley when I first moved to the Roaring Fork Valley, and you're taking the bus. The later home at night you take the bus home, the more other languages you hear. And it is a lot of immigrant population. We rely heavily on J-1 temporary work visas in the ski industry, any of you from the mountain communities. But a lot of those people who are coming on purpose for a fun experience of temporary working, they're housed. The Aspen Skiing Company has figured out how to get dorm-style temporary housing. So it's not the seasonal workforce that I report on, that I'm talking about as being underhoused, because, but I think there's that sentiment. Well, you just came here to be a ski bum anyway, and ski bum is a career, I would argue, and there's many who are not there for that reason.
Okay. Well, I'd love to get back to any of those issues if people have more questions they want to throw into it, or if you guys want to ask each other questions. I wanted to make sure that Marking talks a little bit about your work in Oregon, but also now starting in Colorado, what social determinants of health issues that you find that you will be covering, that you've covered in Oregon, that may be similar Portland obviously has its own fast-changing housing issues, among other communities in Oregon. Tell us what you've been working on here and what you've learned so far.
Sure, thanks. I've been in Colorado all of a month, so I can't speak too authoritatively about housing challenges in Colorado, but over the past year in particular, I've been struck in just about every healthcare story that I did in Oregon, how housing played a role. And so I came here with the intention of, one of the projects I wanted to do was look at the various ways that housing affects healthcare. And what's interesting to me, I think it's quite obvious, obviously, when we talk about, the homeless population, and clearly those are the people with the most needs when it comes to housing. But I've been struck about how this challenge affects pretty much every social demographic strata of our society. You see middle-class families now who are paying, $2,000-$3,000 a month for a mortgage, and yet have a high deductible plan of maybe up to $10,000, and they're having very serious discussions at their kitchen table about the trade-offs. If I go to the doctor this week, can I pay my rent next week? We see this with the ability to attract healthcare providers to rural areas. Sometimes they cannot afford the housing. You can find people who are willing to work in those areas, but they don't have a place to live, a safe place to live. So I'm seeing some communities, particularly here in Colorado, trying to find some creative solutions to that. But one of the other things that struck me, kind of the challenge of being a health reporter and trying to report on these issues is they're so far upstream, and it's hard to make the case to your editor sometime that the root cause of this is not X and Y, it's housing or even further upstream. So, I can do a story on Hep A, and my editor will ask, well, what causes hepatitis A? The answer he's looking for is, well, it's a virus that's transmitted through contaminated food or water. But I could also come to him and say, well, it's caused by crowded housing conditions. Mm-hmm. And I can go even further, and I can say, well, it's caused by institutional racism. Mm-hmm. That's a real hard case to make to the editor, that Hep A is caused by institutional racism. But I think that's kind of the challenge that we as the media need to do. I think we're starting to talk a lot more about the social determinants of health, and we're doing stories specifically on that. But when it comes to the specific issues, it's sometimes hard to include those upstream factors in there.
And I think that's a challenge for everybody here who's listening to think about, because yesterday, there's a huge amount of agreement that it's obvious that these things are big and that they come from on top and that we need to attack them at the higher level. And yet an editor's reaction, and frankly some readers' reaction, might be, well, we've been trying to solve poverty for a couple hundred years in this country, if not longer. That's just too big. We can't bite that off in one story, maybe a whole series, but we don't have space for that anymore. If you guys could talk a little bit more about, and we have a question from the audience about that too, is, well, let's read this. Every time I try to pitch stories to members of the media to amplify, I'm told that my editor will never go for it. So how do we move beyond that barrier? Tina, you play a role as an editor as well as a writer still. How do you guys convince yourselves what to write about? And how do you make something understandable on the individual level, but also at the institutional level?
So that is a challenge. It's a challenge now for different reasons. I mean, one is we have resource questions, right? We have the media landscape in Colorado is drastically diminished the Rocky closed 2009, and
Yep.
The Post has been gutted. We've seen the flourishment of these smaller news sites, but we don't have the capacity that we used to have. So one of the things that I would say is sometimes we get, and I don't mean to turn this into like PR 101, but sometimes we get pitches that clearly they're not at all familiar with what we do. So you're wasting your time and we're not going to do anything with it. What we try to do is they are big public policy stories, and I think as an editor, we are looking for that entry point in that person or circumstance that can illustrate a larger issue. And one of the challenges that we face, and I was actually hearing it in all of these conversations, is we do get pushback, right? Because a lot of the things that we write, especially if we are focusing on the kind of left behind and left out communities, is that it's really easy for people to push that away and say, well, that's happening over there, and that's happening to them, and what does that have to do with me? And so it's incumbent upon us as reporters to make that connection. So one of the things I look for when I'm hearing these pitches is, what is the way that I can make the connection to the larger community, to the health of the larger community, to say to people, we are bound to one another. And a failure to understand that means we will not progress. It's not okay just to have this pocket of abject poverty in this one neighborhood. It's not okay to discriminate based on sexual orientation. And your numbers, oh my God. So I think that's one of the things that we're looking for as an editor, and is helpful, is like, how can we connect the dots to a larger story, to the larger community? I hope that answers.
Jacob, I was going to ask you, because we have a specific question from the audience that relates to convincing editors, convincing the community maybe. So the audience member wrote that the Gazette is written in a conservative community, at least that's a perception. You're happy to address that if you think that's not fair. Sometimes more socially liberal ideas are necessary to advance issues for less advantaged populations. So how do you at the Gazette handle the balance of tenor between those two in those tensions?
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think that Colorado Springs is changing a little bit. It's a little more less conservative actually in the city, but yeah, I mean, definitely El Paso County is very conservative. And so I think that, I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't let any of that sort of, there is no political sort of infringing upon whatever I write. I mean, frankly, when we're in the newsroom, we're just looking at what's the story, you know, and what are the actual issues at play. Let's just dig into that, and that doesn't come across anything that we're considering in terms of actual coverage-wise. But I mean, I do have to understand the community that I'm writing to, and I mean, for example, like with that apartment complex, I mean, there is often a conservative sentiment that you have to work for what you get, sort of thing, and this notion of a free apartment, essentially, although you do pay a little bit of income, it's anathema to a lot of people in the community, and I think that so I do try to go about a story knowing that my audience is going to be a little bit skeptical of this idea, and so it just, to me, that only drives home the portion of that I need to really help tell the stories of the people who are actually, who I'm writing about a lot better, and make it a lot more human. I mean, to the point that we were just talking about, I mean, I think that a way to kind of get my eye on a story a lot better is, all right, there's an interesting issue going on or whatever, but if there's not a person who you know who is affected by it, and if you can help me get it connected to that person, then I can tell the story. Because I just don't think readers pay much attention to a policy story if there's not just a face attached to it. I mean, their eyes glaze over. I mean, my editor's eyes will be like, all right, so what? Well, if there's a person affected, let's write about it. So, I mean, I think that's really the only way that I try and consider my audience is really just trying to, you know, get a sense of maybe what conceptions are out there, and then just tell what reality is. So, yeah.
That leads me to a question that I confront in my own reporting sometimes in terms of telling individual stories that will get people to digest the whole policy story, is the question of fairness and exploitation. How do we tell an individual story knowing that, for example, if we write about someone who is living in an undocumented situation, the first thing we tell them is, please don't read the comments, because the first comment is going to be, go back where you came from, or why are you here? Why are you getting free services? So how do we make sure, and this is a group that we want to talk to about this, because we're often asking people, can you introduce us to someone who is in this situation, whose story we can tell? So how do we as reporters make sure that we do all we can to draw the general public into the story without exploiting the individual that we're talking to? Allison, is that something that you've encountered, and how have you tried to handle that?
First of all, I love policy and I love policy stories, so I actually skew the other way.
Okay.
And one thing that I think is great about reporting on housing or health is that it is a story about every single one of your readers, you know? So we all live somewhere or would like to, and we all need to go to the doctor, should have gone, or you know, so I think there's ways to tell stories that are universal. I have the privilege of writing for a tiny newspaper, which means my population is more concentrated, and housing really is a threat to every one of my readers, and so I don't really have to convince anyone of that. I would also say that if you are pitching for your story to go in the Denver Post or the Nightly News, maybe check in on your local paper. We are also understaffed, but I don't really have to go to my editor because he's busy too. So, you know, like I would encourage you to check in on your local papers and see if they can get that story going, and it will get picked up. I have people come to me, and I think it is responsible for them to be made aware of how this will affect them personally, or how stereotypes come up. I think there's enough people who don't even need it to be their story. They just need the story out there, and so it's important enough that they're involved in that. And so I am lucky, again, to work in a local community where I don't think I have to go find my token homeless person. I'm there, I know their names, they work in town.
Mm-hmm.
They're from Aspen. So as I think a local reporter meeting these people, it's a little easier on my end.
And I do think it's important for us as reporters to help educate the people we're working with, and also the nonprofits who might be helping us, that things are different now in terms of the way that things become a national internet effort against you, that things can build so quickly. You can get doxxed, you can get, you know, just everything, and it lives on forever on the internet, as opposed to when it used to just be printed on the page, and when that was gone, people didn't remember it anymore unless they went to the library and looked at it in a microfilm. Now, your personal story and your picture, and then the link to your address and your phone number and your social media page is all out there. So it's important we consider that.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to try to answer this briefly. I'm sorry, my answers are so long-winded. I just love this question because it's something that I think many of us wrestle with. You know, we don't want just to like slap a body at the top of the story, which is kind of typical, right? You throw your anecdote up at the top, and then it's like public policy, numbers, and then you put the person back at the end and tie a little bow on it, right? So I tend to approach this by telling people in advance, this is what I'm looking for, in as much detail as possible, in as much contradiction as possible, because contradiction is the human experience, and that's how we connect to other people. And these are some likely responses. People are going to tell you that, you know, you just need to work for what you have. People are going to say you need to go back to where you came from. And so you need to be prepared for that. And so I do have these kind of conversations in advance. I worked on a story about a woman who was undergoing eviction, and she was on the record, and the shame that she felt because she was being evicted, even though in the rest of the story I explained the systems that were in effect that could help her, her shame just overcame her, and so she became just the tenant in the story. And, you know, and I have to make space for that. I have to make space for people's experiences. And I will often say, this is your story. You dictate the terms of your story. I only ask that you be honest with me, that you be frank. But if you have something you don't want to say or you don't want to put in print, that is your prerogative. And I think that's an approach I evolved into over many, many years of doing this.
It's very important that we all keep talking about that, because all this has been about trying to give people their agency back and you don't want to take away more of their agency by writing about them in order to explain the story to other people. We only have about a minute and a half left, 2 minutes. Throw this online question. Appreciate all the questions that we got from the audience. In today's world, how do you differentiate your role as journalists from that of advocates and those doing community engagement? Do you feel, let's simplify the question a little bit. Do you see yourself, Marking, are you an advocate? What are you an advocate for?
I think we've all had it kind of drummed into our brains during journalism school and training that we are supposed to be as objective as possible. But the way I look at it is our calling as journalists is to shine a light on the problems that exist in this society and to foster some discussion about solutions. So I don't think we cross into the area of advocacy. I think we try and bend over backwards to be objective, to put diverse viewpoints within our stories. I think we've sometimes gone too far to the point where we're really trying to create a false equivalency between 2 points when there's really only kind of one side to the story. But it's, I think, something that's ingrained in every journalist.
Well, I'd love to have all of you answer that individually if necessary. I encourage all of you to buttonhole all the journalists up here as you see them at the conference to talk about more of these questions that we didn't get to, other questions that came up, but we really appreciate your guys' time in explaining all these things to us and supporting the community. And just one other thing to make sure that your role in supporting journalism, if you feel it's important, is to subscribe to The Independent, become a member of the Colorado Sun, subscribe to the Post, subscribe to Colorado Public Radio, subscribe to the Aspen publications, pick up Out Front. I don't know if they have a membership model, but read Kaiser Health News and encourage your local publication to run Kaiser Health News. Read the Gazette and support the Gazette. It's all part of making sure that there are journalists out there to do this work that we're talking about. So thank you again for your time. We're going to take a 15-minute break now and then come back for the CHI session. Sorry, you guys, that was...
As I talk with folks around the state, not just to talk with the formalized leaders of the community, but when I get to go sit with the first-time mom who's got a nurse visitor who's talking to her about the importance of reading to her daughter every day, the importance of knowing what their developmental stages are. Not only does that change the trajectory of that young woman's life and that child's life, but also the people around her.
Bringing health in reach for all Coloradans is really about leveling the playing field. It's about understanding that health is not in reach for a lot of people today. There are places in Colorado where there's absolutely no access to primary care. There are neighborhoods here in Denver that don't have access to fresh and healthy food. There are places that if you had a prescription, there wouldn't be a pharmacy within 30 miles. So inequities exist everywhere we look. It's really about understanding who's affected by those inequities, what are the root causes of those inequities, and how can we partner with communities to address them.
We're always out there in the different corners of Colorado asking two fairly simple questions. What is it that makes it easy for you to be healthy in your community, and what makes it hard for you to be healthy in your community? And that really informs what we do with our policy work from there.
Listening is paramount. Listening not just to the experts in the field, listening not just to the practitioners on the ground doing the work, but listening to the end user, the end consumer. Low income, marginalized communities, immigrant communities, ethnic minorities, and rural. Those are the populations for whom right now health is furthest away. Those are the populations for whom it is furthest from reach. So that's who we're focusing on.
It's really about making sure that we are learning from the experts, and the experts are the people who live and work in those communities. There's data and there's numbers all day long. When your child is sick, you want to take them to a doctor. That opportunity should exist equally across the state, and it doesn't today.
Health is something that is so fundamental to who we are as people that everybody should get to enjoy good health.
If you have your health, you have everything. So why are we focusing on equity? Because we want everybody to have everything.
I've always been one of those people that believe that home is where the heart is. There's no place like home. But what if you're homeless?
The next thing I knew, I got a phone call on a Friday night, and it's the hospital that's calling. So he says, your son is, he's been in a car accident. He's okay. Okay, when people say okay, what does that mean? You know, people say save up for a rainy day. Well, I did. It just rained longer than I had days, right?
So I was living pretty good, and all of a sudden, when the market fell, homes stopped selling. So I got to the point where I was breaking into empty trailers during the winter months just to stay warm. I was embarrassed. I looked up and down the street to see if I knew anybody before I ran into a food bank or a soup line. I couldn't get benefits because you gotta have an address.
But I was offered a position within the culinary industry as a corporate trainer. So I moved out here expecting to have a job secured. And when I got here, there had been a miscommunication between the management, and the position was given to somebody else. That was devastating. There wasn't any going back. There wasn't anything to go back to.
I mean, at the time I was working at United Airlines. We applied for housing immediately, but application after application, we were either denied or disqualified. The most humiliating part of it, I think, too, was seeing my children go through this. They didn't deserve it. Having to prepare for school was awful. Sometimes when their clothes were wet, they ended up wearing the same thing to school for 2 and 3 days. Homelessness, it's hurtful. It's painful, it's sad and lonely, it's stressful and humiliating. And that's just to name a few.
What can other people do to help those experiencing homelessness? I always say they can ask. Ask the person that's homeless how they became homeless. Don't assume.
Now, anybody in their right mind would have said enough is enough. But being in an abusive relationship, you go back and forth until one day, by the grace of God, he actually left me. And the catch was he left me with all the bills because everything was in my name.
We say, "Ooh, I know that story," but you really don't. You really don't.
I think it's hidden because it's not talked about, you know? It's going to be hidden if we don't talk about it.
It's like I'm an oak table and it's got all these layers of ugly paint on it. And every time I share my story, one of those layers of ugly paint comes off.
We all human. We all brothers and sisters, and we all should stick together.
Seeing people and being involved are the two biggest things I think that people can really start doing to make a difference.
And in this way, we can do it together. We can make a difference together. Because that is what it's going to take. It's going to take all of us participating. And as we do it, we'll see change. But you know what? We've got a lot of work to do.
right. All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be up here sharing some work that our two organizations have recently done around housing, health, and equity. My name is Emily Johnson. I am the Director of Policy Analysis at the Colorado Health Institute, where I lead a lot of our quantitative and housing-related work. For those of you who aren't familiar with CHI, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan health research institute. We believe that better health policy leads to healthier Coloradans, and that health policy is at its best when it's informed by data and evidence. And so that's the lens we brought to the work that we'll be talking about today. And I'm joined by Stephanie Perez-Carrillo.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Stephanie Perez-Carrillo. I am so thankful to be here this morning. I feel honored and privileged to be a representative here of the Health Equity Advocacy Cohort. I work at the Colorado Children's Campaign as a policy analyst. And for those of you that don't know who the Colorado Children's Campaign is, we're a statewide policy and advocacy organization that advocate for the health and well-being of all Colorado kids, just making sure that they can get the best start in life. So before I kind of jump into what Emily alluded to, I want to share a bit of an anecdote. About 10 years ago, I started working in healthcare as a patient advocate. And one of the things that I needed to do, and one of the things that was part of my role, was to make sure that the teams were coordinated in providing the best standard of care for the patient. So when I think about the clinicians that we had to work with, the physicians, the care coordinators, the dietitians, they all coalesced together to bring the best standard of care to patients to ensure that they could safely be discharged home. In many ways, I think that's a very powerful metaphor for how we should be thinking about the health and well-being of our communities. There's not just one organization that ensures the community has everything that it needs. There are direct service providers, public health officials, schools, food banks that all come together to provide a space and a place that ultimately ends in the health and well-being of a community. It's then, and it's in the hands of that community that we can reach that place. So as we think about this, and before I talk a little bit more about the Health Equity Advocacy Cohort, I want to talk about 3 takeaways that I hope as you leave here today that you'll think about. First, that good policy requires inclusive co-creation. You've heard that word thrown around in the last 2 days, and that just means that the people who are most impacted by the policies are at the table and are informing the discussion. Oh, I should probably go back. The other thing is that housing is essential to health, and that change is possible and we know where to start. So where we started, I mentioned the Health Equity Advocacy Cohort. The Children's Campaign is one of 18 organizations that are part of this cohort, and the cohort is made up of different organizational typologies. So what I mean by that is the Children's Campaign is a policy and advocacy organization, and other organizations that are part of the cohort are direct service providers. The Health Equity Advocacy Cohort is supported by the Trust, and when this work first started, the idea behind the Health Equity Advocacy Cohort was that there would be an opportunity to build the field in health equity, and that would result in policies and practices that are rooted and embedded in health equity. What I mean when I say that is that we're dismantling structural and systemic racism. We can undo the policies that have put us here by this co-creation process that I alluded to earlier. So if you'll notice these circles here, this image just represents how we worked before we came together as a cohort. This strategy has been going for 5 years. And when we first came together, we all had different priorities. Our organizations focus on different things. You'll notice the Colorado Fiscal Institute, the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. Our organization isn't listed there purposefully because there's 18 organizations. Not all are represented. Each of those have their own specific priorities. So one of the biggest challenges when we came together was that we all had different priorities. So we wanted to coalesce and come together and think about how we could address policy through a health equity lens. But first, we needed to name our biases individually in our respective organizations and then address those. The biggest challenge was in how we did that together. Obviously, a really simple task. So it only took us about 5 years to get to that place where we could say, hey, we have privilege in certain spaces as the Children's Campaign. You have certain privilege working with community. How do we bring all those things together and create the strongest policy? So one of the inhibitors or one of the challenges with this model that you see right here is that this creates moments in policy. And what we really want is a movement. We want to build a movement that's inclusive of communities and direct service organizations and policy and advocacy organizations. So after 5 years of reconciling all these challenges and how we talk about our privilege and our identities, which was extremely rewarding for me, we came to this as our collective why. When you think about organizations and companies that are successful, what makes them successful is being able to name the why behind their practice, the why behind their product. So for us, this was our collective why as the cohort, and this was the way that we were going to build a movement. We believe that oppressive and racist practices have negatively impacted the health of Coloradans for too long. We're determined to replace inequitable systems that allow only a few to thrive by creating new programs and policies that support everyone. This was the messaging that we landed on just last year. And this is how we're hoping folks in community will talk about health and health equity. So what that means is what I alluded to earlier, that we can undo policies that have only benefited a few, and we can address systemic and structural racism by our co-creation process. So you'll notice that this is how we started, and this is how we ended up. When we think about what it takes to build a movement, think about the organizations that were in this image before. You have Tri-County Health Network, Lake County Build a Generation, who you'll hear from in just a little bit as it relates to this report and some of the great work we're doing. And you'll notice that they will be at the center of this movement right here. They're the direct service organization, they're the direct service providers that are working directly with community. And when we're thinking about policy, if you'll consider that blue circle, that's who needs to be at the very center of our policy creation process. Rather than creating our policies in silos and having one or two wins, this can result in the movement that we want to see. So we don't expect that this is going to take just a single year. In fact, I just told you it took us 5 years to even come to a collective definition of what our work looked like, and we're just getting started. So after we came to our collective why, we said, we need to act now. What's a logical way for us to move forward? Since we did come together around policy and wanting to create that change at a systemic level, we thought to ourselves, let's get to the legislature. Let's testify, let's create policies that we know are coming straight from community, because community is part of this cohort. So this past session, I know a lot of you heard about the wins that happened this past session, and the cohort actually prioritized six bills. And I'll explain how this was a different process than last year. Last year, we decided we wanted to prioritize housing and health, because when we think about it, that's at the root of everything that we do. Regardless of which of the 18 organizations you worked for, housing and health are fundamental to how we live and work and exist. So one of the things that we ultimately decided was that we needed to use our shared power, this found power that we had in our identities and our privilege, to impact spaces such as policy. So when I alluded to these 6 pieces of legislation that we followed at the legislature, 5 of those passed. And what was different was, rather than having one of those organizations testify, we had 4 organizations testifying from the space of health equity. When you consider the Warranty of Habitability bill, we'll not take credit for that as a cohort, because many people worked on that bill. But there was a specific panel in that committee testifying around how this impacts health equity and how important it is that that's prioritized as we're thinking about policies that we passed. As you can imagine, there was a lot of momentum. 83% is pretty successful when you think about our engagement and when you think about how we came together around those bills. But the question was, what were we missing? What was something that was missing from the conversation? One, some of the bills that were prioritized were already bills that the member organizations were working on. But 2, we didn't necessarily have the data and the research that talked about it in a Colorado-specific way. So one of the things we did was, in December, just before the legislative session, we decided that we wanted to prioritize research that showed the inexplicable link between the two. And this was a really interesting process, because we wanted to make sure that what came out of this process was research that folks could talk about. You didn't have to be a policy wonk to be able to read this research paper. You didn't have to be a person that even historically worked in housing to understand the information that came out of this research paper. So when we wrote the RFP, or even when we started this process, there were 3 things that we wanted to make sure were true at the end. Knowing that we had learned about our privilege, knowing that we had to work together, knowing that we had to allow people of color to step up, what we did was create a small housing group. And I don't mean tiny houses. We created a group from folks from different organizations within the cohort that worked on this project specifically. So our charge was to write an RFP, to think about the communities that we wanted to prioritize, and then ultimately think about how we could create research or give research to community so that they could advocate for this not only at the state level, but at the local level. And you'll hear more about some of these policies from Emily, but I just want to talk about the process because I think that's the biggest thing and that's the biggest shift in getting to this movement that we're trying to build. First, our process was rooted in equity. Secondly, it was prioritized by cohort members. And lastly, we provided plenty of opportunities for input and consultation. Why is this important? It's important because it wasn't something that policy folks sat around a table and said, hey, we're going to prioritize these 4 or 5 things. It was inclusive every step of the way. We asked the cohort, who are the communities that we need to prioritize? We asked, what are the strategies that make the most sense, that are responsive to urban, rural, and suburban needs? And lastly, how are people going to use this information? So we wanted to make sure that we were soliciting information along the way, or soliciting that feedback along the way. So what the research emphasizes and what we concluded was something that was actually pretty intuitive, if you can imagine. Go figure. The research emphasizes that this issue affects Coloradans from all walks of life. It also is compounded for people of color, families with low incomes, and immigrant families. It forces families to make difficult choices. As you heard yesterday and today, sometimes they have to choose between buying food or paying for their medical bills. And so for us, when we found out these conclusions and when we came to this, what we already knew, we asked ourselves what was the next logical step. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Emily, and she's going to talk about some of that research.
Thank you. All right, so now we'd like to turn to this discussion of housing and health and really talk about how those 2 concepts have to go hand in hand. So let's start with a look at housing in Colorado first. What Stephanie just said about the housing research might not be shocking to you. I don't think a day goes by that I don't hear or see a news story about the housing affordability crisis in Colorado. These are just 3 examples from the past couple weeks. We just had a panel up here of folks in the media talking about how key housing is. But what we're hoping to do today, one of our main goals, is to talk about the data behind those stories. And so let's start with housing cost burden. Housing cost burden is generally defined as a household that must spend at least 30% of its income on housing costs. Usually the majority of that is a rent or a mortgage, but this can also include HOA fees, property taxes, and other similar costs. We know that Colorado comes 14th in the United States in terms of the percentage of our residents that are housing cost burden, and 2nd of the non-coastal states just after Nevada. And I don't think this is abstract. I think a lot of us feel this in our daily lives. So over the past decade, the average home price in Colorado has grown by 77%, while median income in Colorado has grown by just 4.5%. Likewise, when we look at renters, 45%, nearly half of renters in Colorado are housing cost burden, meaning that they're hitting that 30% mark and often having to make some of those difficult decisions that Stephanie just alluded to. And so when we talk about housing and the affordability concerns affecting people from all walks of life, this is what we're talking about here. And most Coloradans, I think, do see this and can relate to this. We know that 60% of people in Colorado say that they think their community is currently facing a housing crisis. But only 1 of 3 Coloradans think that housing and health are intimately tied together. And I think that's something that makes this audience very different from most Coloradans. Just by nature of the work that a lot of us do, we see this every day, this really strong connection between housing and health. And so there's this question of, well, why is this such a profound connection? Why is the 2019 Colorado Health Symposium so focused on housing? Like I said, I think a lot of us have seen this in our own experience, whether that's professional experience or personal experience. We might have a family member who is having a harder time getting up the stairs than she used to, and we see that all the time. And a lot of times our experience can clue us into something happening even before the research has caught up. We've talked a lot at this conference about stories and data. Sometimes those stories come first. So one example I think of is smoking. There was a lot of suspicion around cigarettes and health long before C. Everett Koop came out with those definitive research studies on the connection between smoking and health. And likewise with housing, again, a lot of us see this, but there is a growing body of research that's now there to back this up. So what does the research say so far? Well, let's look at 1978. Lead paint was first identified as a contaminant or as a carcinogen for houses, and since then there have been a number of toxicological studies from the 80s, 90s through till today on its effects. In 2014, the Institute of Medicine came out with recommendations around providers actually asking specifically about housing as a social determinant of health in that healthcare setting. And then just a couple of years ago, Matthew Desmond, who I don't know if he's here right now, but wrote this wonderful book, Evicted, won the Pulitzer Prize, that brought a lot of this conversation around housing and equity to a much larger audience. And so we are definitely seeing the research bases grow, and our goal is to add to that continually growing body of evidence. And to underscore that when we talk about housing insecurity, we're not just talking about one thing. We're not just talking about affordability. We're talking about, is your house a safe place to live? Are things accessible both within your home and within your community? Can you get to grocery stores? Can you get to access healthcare services? And then, of course, affordability is always a really important factor in here. And these and many other dimensions of housing have really important ties to health. So, for example, housing affordability and food insecurity often go hand in hand. When we look at low-income households that are housing cost burdened, we find that they spend $190 per month less on food than similar income households who don't have that housing cost burden. We also know that home design matters. So if you are someone with limitations to your physical activity, you may need a home that supports that, but a lot of houses don't. For example, nationally, less than 1% of homes are wheelchair accessible. And finally, a place where I think we see some of those most profound interactions between housing and health are with our homeless populations in Colorado. There are 11,000 people in Colorado who are living without stable housing. And we know that these communities without stable housing have a life expectancy that is 30 years shorter than other folks, which makes it just 47 years. And I think about when we think about the reasons behind that, some of those I think we can kind of intuit. If you are homeless, you're exposed to more extreme heat and cold. You're more likely to suffer traumatic injuries. You are more vulnerable to infectious diseases such as viral hepatitis or tuberculosis, a couple of which were just mentioned in that panel. In addition, chronic diseases such as heart disease and cancer are much more difficult to manage without that stable housing. And so the report that we've been talking about, which will be coming out in a few weeks, is going to look at housing in Colorado more broadly, but will also focus on some of these populations where the struggles are a little bit more pronounced, or much more pronounced, I should say. The 7 communities this report will focus on were selected by the cohort because of the special challenges they face. They include communities of color for whom discriminatory and racist practices of the past and today are still playing out in terms of housing equity. Families with kids who are often facing cost battles on 2 fronts, increasing costs of childcare and increasing costs of housing. Low-income households who often rely on affordable housing or housing vouchers that can be in limited or short supply in Colorado. People with disabilities who, as we mentioned, often have disparate needs when it comes to how their housing looks and are often finding that housing that supports those needs is in short supply. Immigrants without documentation who are often excluded from using some of those publicly available services that are made available to support housing affordability. people experiencing homelessness, who we already spoke to, and this is a group for whom those housing and health challenges are often the most profound. And then finally, down there that says rural communities, looking at rural communities who also face struggles with housing affordability, but where we don't frequently see as many affordable housing solutions available. And so the report will provide information on all of these communities and look at them separately. But today, we want to focus specifically on communities of color for a couple reasons. Number one, this is a group that overlaps with many of these other groups. None of these 7 groups are really living in a vacuum. And number two, we know that a lot of the discriminatory policies of the past are in fact racist policies. And we are very much seeing that play out when we look at inequities facing communities of color today when it comes to both housing and health. So let's start by looking at some of those policies from the past. This is a map from 1945 or so that looks at redlining in Colorado. And we see that when we look at these types of maps, it's not too surprising that race matters a lot for housing, specifically even separately from income. Redlining, I know, has been talked a lot about this conference today, and I know that the Undesign the Red Line exhibit is here, but just as a quick kind of refresher, these maps indicate spots in this example, Denver, where banks and mortgage companies were basically told not to make loans to folks who lived in those redlined areas due to their racial demographics. We also saw in the past things like neighborhood covenants where people agreed not to sell houses to communities of color. But I want to emphasize that this is not just something we were looking at in the past. Policies like redlining are now illegal, but we are still seeing policies of today that have similar impacts. One example is a phenomenon called reverse redlining. And this is where financial institutions target communities of color with higher cost or higher interest loans, increasing the risk of default. This is something we saw very vividly in the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. We also see different zoning laws across the state where single-family homes are the only zoning that's allowed to be, or are the only types of homes that are allowed to be built in new areas, and this also limits the supply of affordable housing. And I bring these up just to emphasize that when we talk about these discriminatory and racist practices, these aren't just things that are on people of the past, they're very much on us today. To think about, to talk about, and to look for ways to solve. And when we think about what impact these policies, both from the past and these ongoing policies, have, we see this play out a lot in the numbers, especially when we look at groups by race or ethnicity. And I want to emphasize that this isn't a monolith. There are very different experiences, both within these different groups and between Hispanic and Latinx families, Black or African American households, Asian and Pacific Islander communities. But when we look between groups and across groups, we do see some trends emerge. For example, we know that homeownership was the single largest source of economic expansion that happened during the 20th century, and intergenerational wealth is largely built through homeownership. We also know that homeownership is associated with increased housing stability and reduced housing cost burden. When we look at homeownership rates in Colorado, Black or African American Coloradans, fewer than half own their homes compared with about 3 of 4 white Coloradans. And even though Hispanic and Latinx households have made the largest gains in homeownership in the past decade, there's still a huge disparity there. It's not just about homeownership, though. We also know that displacement is a really large concern for many communities. So for example, the Highlands, Rhino, and 5 Points in Denver are all undergoing large changes right now and seeing major displacement. And I picked 3 communities from Denver for a reason. And that's because Denver is currently seeing the second highest rate of displacement for Hispanic and Latinx families of any city in the United States, only following San Jose, California. And we've talked a lot about this connection between housing and health, so it's not too surprising that given these disparities we're seeing, we're also seeing a lot of health disparities play out as well. When we ask Coloradans how they would rate their overall health, about 12% of white Coloradans say that they would rate it as fair or poor, compared with nearly 1 of 5 Hispanic or Latinx Coloradans. Which brings us to our final takeaway. It's important to know where we have been and where we stand today, to understand where we can go from here, and we know that change is possible and there are places we can start. One example is looking at our policies around manufactured homes. And so Michael Booth referred to this today. A lot of times people will own manufactured homes but not own the land beneath those homes. Hispanic and Latinx families are much more likely to own these homes than other Coloradans. But by not owning the land beneath those homes, this makes people very vulnerable to the rent increases that were discussed today, as well as displacement if the owner of that land decides to sell it. So in some places like Oregon, they've adopted new policies that help promote community ownership of these lands. If a landlord decides to sell the manufactured home park land, the community has 10 days to get together and decide if they want to work with the state to secure additional funding to potentially purchase that land for themselves. We also see what we can call preference policies as new housing developments are being built that help address some of this displacement that we've talked about. This is basically where, when new housing developments are built, some of those units are reserved for existing members of the community to try to mitigate some of those impacts of gentrification. And so San Francisco, for example, has a policy saying that 40% of units in a new affordable housing development have to be reserved for members who are living in the community. And finally, when we look at how people pay for their housing, people pay for it in a variety of ways. And we know that some communities of color in Colorado are more likely to use housing vouchers than white Coloradans. But we also know that a lot of landlords will discriminate against the use of housing vouchers, either due to general discrimination or due to the fact that they are worried a government shutdown or some other factor outside of their control will make this an unstable form of rent. And so one option here might be to ban income discrimination when it comes to rental housing, and that includes housing vouchers as a source of income. And so we've talked a lot about housing and how it's important for health and how health is important for housing. But I would also say that I think that housing is just part of our American ethos and something that we value, not just for some of us, but for all of us. So for example, if we all take a couple moments and picture the words "the American dream," what comes to mind? Okay, so it's a little bit cheating because we are in the middle of a housing presentation, in the middle of a housing conference. But even if this were on any given day, if you were like 94% of Americans, you probably pictured something to do with the home. That could be a white picket fence in Grand Junction. That could be a townhome in Curtis Park. Maybe you went a little more rural. Maybe you just went for that ski lodge in Summit County. An apartment in Montbello might be home, or a yurt in Saguache County. And the point here is that home means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But by picturing one image, no matter what image you just pictured, you're picturing something that excludes the majority of Coloradans or the majority of Americans. And that's because housing is an incredibly complex topic. What we want or need out of our housing differs for all of us. It depends on our resources. It depends on our living situation. It depends on what we need in our home. So I would like to make the argument that the American dream refers not only to access to a home, but a home that supports you living your healthiest life. So to close out today, I want to reiterate the 3 takeaways that Stephanie referenced earlier. The first being that when we are working around policy that has to do with equity, housing equity, health equity, et cetera, it is at its best when it is informed by an inclusive and co-creative process like the one Stephanie described. Second, we know that housing is essential to health, and we know that both from our own experience and from this growing body of research. And finally, change is possible. We know where to start, and I would actually say, based on what we've seen in this past legislative session and before it, it has already begun. So with that, we would like to thank the Colorado Trust and the Health Equity Advocacy Cohort for their leadership on this topic. We would like to thank the Colorado Health Foundation for this amazing opportunity to share this information today, and to all of you. Thank you so much.
right. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody feeling and doing? Good? Awesome. Wonderful. My name is Maribel Cifuentes. I'm a portfolio director at the Colorado Health Foundation. And my team and I have the great privilege of leading the foundation's new affordable housing strategy and portfolio of work. And so today, I also get to moderate this wonderful panel, and I'll start with just a few very brief reflections, and then we'll launch into introductions. But this morning, you've already had an opportunity to hear about the affordable housing crisis from the perspective of the media, from the perspective of the data that's informing this work, the research that's informing it, and also the policy solutions that are coming into play, of which we've had a number of really big policy wins in Colorado very recently. So that's really great news. So what I'd like to do for this panel is to shift the focus a little bit to what do these solutions look like at the community level. And specifically, we have three tremendous panelists with us today who can really help us understand what those solutions look like for their specific communities. So rather than doing the introduction, I'm gonna actually allow them to introduce themselves, their role, and tell us a little bit about the organizations that each of them represent and how they came to this work at the intersection of housing and health. Who would like to start?
Hi, my name is Eudelia Contreras, and I work for Lake County Build a Generation. And this organization works on capacity building for the community that we work with.
My name is Amy Cox. I'm the CEO of an organization called Community Health Partnership in Colorado Springs. We've been around for 27 years. We came together, a group of major health providers in our community came together to address issues of uncompensated care in 1992, so it predated the Affordable Care Act and any health care reform in Colorado. And we have since pivoted really to be an organization that focuses on improving the health of the Pikes Peak region, and we do that through pioneering processes of collaborative leadership that result in improvements in measurable improvements in health outcomes. And we felt the need to have an organization that in the community that really focused on problem solving. So not specific issues, but on the ability to bring community organizations together to solve problems. I came to the work, I've been with CHP for 2.5 years. I came to the work through a career mostly in local government, starting in parks and recreation. Do we have any parks people here? Fabulous work if you can get a job in parks and recreation. The sitcom is pretty accurate, but you get to see a lot in communities when you work to improve access to trails, access to playgrounds, and I did a lot of that work. And then eventually I moved into working for our city council in Colorado Springs as the administrator in the change in our to a strong mayor form of government. I also served as an elected official in my little town of Manitou Springs for 4 years, really working on access to safe places to play in our community. So that's how I come to this work. One of the key issues I've been involved with is really around homelessness and trying to make that connection, bringing some of the work around administering our continuum of care into community health partnership.
Am I on? Yeah. Good morning. My name is Hassan Latif, and I'm Executive Director of Second Chance Center. We're located in Aurora and are dedicated to working with folks coming home from prison and jail. You got to give me a minute. My stomach is still flipping. I've worked rougher rooms than this, but this is actually the biggest audience I've ever been in front of. Y'all really know how to turn out. I got into this work pretty much based on necessity after having done 18 years of incarceration in the state of Colorado. I came home 13.5 years ago, and I was very fortunate to be able to come home to my wife Imani and a home for myself. So that was one significant challenge that was removed from my transition process. But the folks that we work with every day at Second Chance Center it's one of the biggest issues for us to try to address. And so we've been fortunate to have a lot of help in trying to get some momentum behind housing for our folks. And we're currently building a 50-unit permanent supportive housing project, a low-income housing tax credit project in Aurora called Providence at the Heights. And looking forward to being leased up and opened by the beginning of next year. And we're pretty excited about that opportunity, and so are our folks. Actually, I have one of our clients who came to me at the beginning of the process saying, "Look, I can get you all the drywall you need." It was an offer that I declined, and we had a conversation about it afterwards. But they're pretty excited and want to be helpful in whatever way they can be. So I look forward to sharing whatever I can about this process with you all. Thank you.
That's great. Great start. So I'm going to do a little bit of a hot potato sort of a thing here and ask maybe each one of you just a few questions. And there are certainly some questions that I think all of you will have different perspectives on. So feel free to jump in if you want to add anything. So the first question is for Amy. And it's really about reflecting on your previous role, launching the Colorado Springs Initiative to End Homelessness, and now your current role as CEO at CHP. Reflecting on all of that, what do you think are the solutions that are actually helping to address the needs of people experiencing homelessness, and where are the most pressing challenges that are still keeping us from advancing this work?
Well, I'd like to thank Jacob Rogers from the Gazette, who was on the previous panel, for teeing this up a little bit, because the work in Colorado Springs really only began about 5 years ago as sort of a community effort. It's not to say that there weren't organizations in our community that were doing good work. It's just that it wasn't really a public issue. Mm-hmm. And what happened was we had a change in our form of government, from a council manager form to a strong mayor form. And we elected our first strong mayor, who had very strong and visionary opinions about what we needed to do in our community. And ending homelessness, he was a very business-oriented man, but ending homelessness was a personal passion of he and his wife. And so it was a really key time in our community to have a leader step up and say, we need to end homelessness in our community. And I happened to work with the city council at the time, and he brought and I had been getting a lot of phone calls, and he brought me over to help lead that initiative. And what we did was we really started with talking in our community with providers and developed a very simple plan. So we had this mantra. It was think big, build simple, act now. We couldn't wait, because he was pretty much going to be a one-term mayor, and we needed to get something started. And so, we saw things in our community, like 3 people were administering our continuum of care. So there was the community of providers wasn't connected. We had very little, we had almost no permanent supportive housing. We didn't even know what the affordable housing need was in our community. We had very limited shelter. We had no low barrier shelter. So we had people, sleeping outside in the winter. So a lot of this felt like really low-hanging fruit. Like, I think, to sort of quote Jacob again, we were a little bit behind the times. One of the pivotal things that we did was we did a call for projects. We had some CDBG funding available, and we did a call for projects, and for shelter beds. And we offered $1 million, and we got no viable proposals. There just was nobody in the community with the capacity to do it. And so we met with one specific organization, Springs Rescue Mission. Their CEO is here with us. And he said, hey, if you can make a commitment to us for a period of time, then we can do this. And so there was some learning there about building the capacity of organizations in our community and staying with them for the long haul, because too often I think city governments come in, they offer something very temporary, and then they move on to what the next big issue is. But we stuck with the Springs Rescue Mission. We were able to open a campus, the first showers in our community, the first laundry facilities, adequate number of shelter beds, low barrier. We created we just opened our first permanent supportive housing complex or apartment building with the rescue mission. But we also built capacity within our organizations to, like, where is the money? How do you apply for it? How do you train people to do this work? And so that capacity has really resulted in other really great performing organizations in our community being able to apply and develop these projects on their own. Right. So I think that vision and that capacity building were really key parts of this. And doing it as a partnership, really figuring out how to bring all the organizations together. When I left the city and moved to Community Health Partnership, it was really important to me that we begin to make the link in our community between health and housing. And the slide that only a third of Americans see the link is pretty accurate in my experience. And so we did work. I worked with our continuum of care to move that operation, the administration, and all the data collection and all of the planning into CHP's offices so that our board, which is largely, again, health care providers, would begin to make the connection. And I think that's very important, that we have leadership in our community willing to set vision and not just be managing homelessness or let's just try and prevent it, but really focused on ending homelessness and what that requires.
Thank you, Amy. Shifting gears just a little bit, but not too far, talking about vision and about permanent supportive housing. Hassan, you had a vision for permanent supportive housing to serve the needs of the community that you serve. And that's how PATH comes about, right? So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what you have planned for the permanent supportive housing that you're building in Aurora, and why you think that specific housing solution was the right one to address the needs of your clientele.
Thank you, I'll try. I actually backed into this housing arena, for lack of a better phrase. When Emily and Stephanie were talking about co-creative processes, actually that's the history of Second Chance Center. I founded it 7.5 years ago, and actually for a year it was a mobile unit in my car. And the first 2 people I brought on, collectively, we had 75 years of incarceration time. So quite naturally, people are wondering, what are these guys up to? And understandably, and we functioned like that, like we were under the hugest microscope possible. And the benefit of that has been that not only did people get to see what we were doing, but how we were going about our work. When it came to housing, this was an issue that affected almost every one of our clients. Either they were coming out of prison and going to halfway houses, which was temporary, because they're going to come out of there needing housing, or they were being paroled, many of which are paroled every month rather in Colorado. 150 people are being released homeless every month in Colorado. And we were struggling like everyone else to find housing for them. Mm-hmm. And we were putting people in temporary housing in hotels, motels up and down Colfax, which anyone can open the door at 11 o'clock at night and be confronted with whatever triggered their worst decisions in life. So not the best situation. We were putting people in shelters, and housing is so bad in Denver Metro that the Division of Adult Parole has relaxed the association requirement. It used to be a time when you could be returned to prison for associating with someone else on parole. And so they've quietly relaxed that. And so what happened as a result is housing became available. Private owners renting to as many people with felony convictions as possible, sometimes putting 6 or 7 people in 2-bedroom homes. And we were doing the same thing because we had no other options. And about 3 years ago, there was a murder at one of the houses we had 3 clients living at. Thank God they were all at work and not involved. But when I went to the scene, the owner was there, and he took me into the basement where there was a partition that didn't go up to the wall, to the ceiling, but it had 2 bunk beds on either side, and it was pretty horrific kind of conditions, if you ask me. And I asked him if it looked like that when he moved people in, and he was incredulous. He was like, yeah, why? Well, the why was that it looked worse down there than upstairs where someone had gotten shot in the head. And I left there thinking 2 things. 1, these people need to be out of business. and 2, we can't send our folks there anymore. And so we started to scramble and ask private owners to trust us. If they didn't want to rent to people with felonies, then master lease to Second Chance Center. And we would take on the responsibility of taking care of the property, renting the property, paying the rent. And our folks, when they transitioned from these places, they would have a rental history and not just have to say they just got out of prison or the halfway houses. And, you know, we weren't property managers, so it was a series of headaches and adjustments we had to make, and it wasn't really ideal for us. But then about 3 years ago, I met Jen Lopez, who was working out of Governor Hickenlooper's Office of Homeless Initiatives. And it took me about a year to hook up with her. She was ducking me for a year. And finally, myself and Sean Taylor, our deputy director, we had got an opportunity to be on PBS. And I think she had seen that. I saw her at a fundraiser, and I stepped to her. I said, Jen Lopez, looking at her name tag. She said, Hassan Latif. I said, I've been trying to catch you for a year. She said, you're a celebrity now. So I said, I'll take advantage of that. But anyway, I invited her to Second Chance Center, and she came on the 4th of June, 2016, all excited about the idea of permanent supportive housing. I've never heard of it before. And she was telling us that there was a possibility we could be trained to be competitive in the low-income housing tax credit market, and that we could build an apartment for our folks. And I was like, really? And it was hard to fathom, but she was so excited and enthused about the idea. And I was like, okay, let's see what happens with this. And we applied for tax credits in June of 2017, and we got a lot of negative kind of feedback. Like, no one gets tax credits on the first opportunity. And our population is not really akin to a basket of kittens or puppies, so no one would really be supportive of that kind of project for our folks primarily. But that didn't deter us. We've been blessed to do a lot of things for the first time, and we were awarded in September of 17. We broke ground January 4th this year, which happened to coincide with the 13th anniversary of my walking out of prison, which wasn't planned.
Amazing.
It wasn't planned, but we had a lot of delays, you know, with the kind of struggles we had with the city and with our neighbors. But we topped off our roof this week, and we're looking to be housing folks by the beginning of January next year. What I think is great about this particular kind of housing, and it's really only going to scratch the surface. We'll be housing 50 individuals and families there, but the fact that there is support connected to the housing. And we had to expand our tenant selection process, so now to include the chronically homeless, folks with disabilities, not just folks recently released, but, you know, our feeling is that people who have a series of episodes of homelessness, they're probably dealing with some of the same issues that send our clients to prison. Mental health issues, substance use disorders, and trauma and the lack of aid recovering from it. And so we think we're well equipped to kind of help that population as well. So what we think is that people have a home to come to. If they have a community to feel a part of, then they're going to value their lives and their place in this community much more. And so there's no way for us to measure right now what the impact will be. But my feeling is that the people who were most ardently against this project over the last 2 years, 2 years from now will be thinking, why were we even tripping?
Nice. Udilia, I want to chat with you about the work that you've been doing in Lake County around manufactured home communities, actually, which was brought up also actually by both panels and presentations that preceded us. I know that you've been doing some work on the ground with manufactured home communities. So I'm wondering if you can share with us, what are some of the challenges that are unique to those communities, and what are some of the solutions that you're seeing really starting to work?
Thank you. So manufactured home communities, one thing that really resonated with me in the presentation was I think what it was called reverse redlining, I believe. That is a huge challenge. You'll never, most likely, I think we're starting to get to some solutions, but yeah, you don't own the property that your home sits on. And these homes, if you get a loan out for them, they are, you get that loan at like 14% interest rate. And a stick-built home is like, I just recently learned, like as low as 3%. Because they're not considered actually homes, they're considered vehicles. It's like a car, so it keeps the value of them keeps going down, but that's our home. So that is a big challenge. Another big challenge is that there are different laws that govern people in manufactured home parks than in stick-built homes. And so rent increases, there can be rent increases sometimes up to 3 times a year without following I think it's 60-day notice. So that is really difficult. But I think too that there is a sense of, how Hassan was saying, there's a sense of community. So I think that's where the resiliency comes from people that live in manufactured home parks. And taking pride in where we live. It's interesting because we say in English, right, it's manufactured home parks, and we learned to say that rather than trailer parks. And I was just speaking in Spanish, we say trailer park, parquedero de trailers, and it even is associated with a sense of community. When I say, oh, I live there, the community that I work there even gets closer. Like, oh, you understand, you know. But yeah, those are some of the challenges. I think, though, that with, we had the Manufactured Home Park Act that wasn't really, from what I understand, really wasn't being, there was no oversight for it. Now we have, with the great work, with working together with the cohort, House Bill 1309 just recently passed. That is going to be huge. One of the biggest things in there is I believe, is the hopefully that residents will get the option, if the park ever goes up for sale, that residents would get the option to be able to purchase that.
Got it. So more of that resident-owned community model.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that model?
Yeah, definitely. I think that would, because right now you are subject to, I live in a manufactured home park, so I'm subject to, again, like these unexpected fees, and you don't have the freedom really to even small things like building a deck. I want to make my home outside look nice, and I get a notice on my door. Actually, no, you cannot do that. It has to be smaller. I always feel like I'm going to push you down a little more. You can't make it look nice. So I think, but still, when you go into these communities, they're very nice communities. So can you imagine what it would be like if we owned the land too? It would make it much nicer, and so proud of our community.
Thank you, Udilia. Sorry, I was looking at some questions that are coming from the audience. Let me piggyback on what you just said, because as part of your work, clearly you are working and you are part of the community, right, that you're working in. And so you get to hear stories from people that are being personally, directly impacted, right, by these challenges and these opportunities also that are happening around affordable housing and lack of housing opportunities. So I wonder, and this is actually a question for all 3 panelists, but we'll start with you, if there's a specific story that has stuck with you, that has resonated with you, that gives a face to what this looks like in your community specifically.
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, it's, so I'm going to say my, just my lived experience, if that's
Sure.
okay. So growing up, in housing, I always wondered, like, why my parents got here to this country from Mexico when housing was very cheap. So I'm like, why did my parents never buy a house? What happened? Like, did we not work hard enough? Was it something we did? Those were the messages that I was always receiving. And now learning about all of this, it's like, oh, it's these barriers. It's all these policies, these racist policies that are still showing up today. And so living in manufactured home parks, probably the hardest thing is around evictions and how quickly they can happen. And how easily it is for a landlord to go and stick an eviction notice on somebody's door without thinking about all the turmoil it can cause. Telling a family, a single mom of 3 children, telling her, you need to get out in the next 3 days because you're 1 day late. And so this really, I mean, it's the stress. And then where we live in Lake County, most people are driving over here to Summit County and Eagle County in the winter. And now my middle child now tells me, I see it showing up now, because what happens in your childhood does not stay in your childhood. It shows up later in life. And whenever I get into an argument with now my partner, so that's that second income now, she says, Mom, please work it out, because I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to go back to hiding from the park manager, because he's going to kick us out. Please, work it out. She cries. She's like, I don't want our electricity to get shut off, because that's what it is. It's either you pay electricity in the winter time or you pay your space rent.
Impossible choices and trade-offs.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that story. Yeah. Amy, do you have a story that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think a lot of this work requires quite a bit of resilience and stamina, because it takes a long time. And I can tell you that from my experience, I grew up in a home with a single mom. I had 2 brothers, and born into homelessness, and that's a whole nother story. And she wouldn't call it that, because you don't call people homeless, because when you call them homeless, they become invisible. And so she always worked to make sure there was a roof over our heads. But I remember working at Payless Shoe Source, she managed to scrape together enough money to buy a house in a neighborhood, just a tiny little, very simple house in a neighborhood in Colorado Springs that within 10 years was so dilapidated, and the quality of the house was so poor that she just picked up and left it. There was no way to sell it. There was no way to recover any investment. And I think from there, watching her have to leave, and then, me, by then I was in college and able to go out and find my own place. This whole idea of home became so important to me that's why, I went to the university and I said, I want to work in community development. I want to know why it is this happens to families. We worked hard, and she couldn't keep her place. And then for me, even buying I bought a home when I was 27. I had a baby. I said, I got to buy a house. And I bought this little house that I still live in. It's so affordable when you buy a house 20 years ago and stay in it. But in this little town in Manitou Springs. And I will tell you this, that buying a place and having a place to call home gave me a place to invest my talents, and to build parks in my town, and to go to the city council meetings and demand policy changes, and to become an elected official, to go get a master's degree, to do all of these things because I knew I had a place to live, and I was fortunate to buy at a time that it was affordable. And I was just a receptionist at a county parks department, but I was able to do that. And I think my community, Manitou Springs, Colorado Springs, has benefited from the fact that I had a stable place to live, raising millions of dollars to do projects in that community and leading efforts to make sure other people can get housed.
Thank you for that reflection. Very powerful. Hassan?
Yes, working with our population it keeps so many things green for me, watching people struggle. We were asked in the legislature last year, one of the representatives asked me what was the secret sauce that resulted in a recidivism rate of under 10% for the last 5 years at Second Chance Center. And the only thing I could think of was that that whole provider-recipient power dynamic, we reject that at Second Chance Center. We choose to partner with our folks. And what we say is that the better they do, the better we're going to be able to do. And this is the truth. It's not just smoke. I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that our folks were coming back out, reintegrating, getting jobs, not reoffending, I certainly wouldn't be sitting on this stage in front of all you beautiful people. So for a population that is felt apart from as opposed to a part of most of their lives, that's very important. They feel a part of a Second Chance Center. I think this continues on to reintegrating into a community where you actually have a home to go to every day, and people who you know and who know you and who welcome you. And I can't imagine how much more difficult my transition would have been had I not been able to actually come home and have that part of it, you know, removed from the equation. Not that coming home and finding space for me was all that easy. My wife is sitting in the front. You all, she walked 18 years down with me, and she's starting to think that maybe her investment is going to pay off. You know, but it took about 3 years for me to get any significant closet space, and I had those kind of challenges.
I understand.
But our folks, the challenges they face are much more significant and much more difficult. And you know, what we say to our folks at Second Chance Center is that life can be different. You just have to do things differently. And a lot of our work revolves around cognitive restructuring and getting people to think a little bit differently. The formula we work off is thoughts plus feelings equals behavior. So really, if people think the same way and feel the same way about the world, their place in it, the likelihood is that they'll behave in similar fashions. But we have folks who have never had a home. You know, we've had folks that grew up in foster care, that grew up in juvenile facilities, that went from grandma's house to the big house. And those places that we master lease, we furnish them, including food in the refrigerator and matching silverware, because we want to set a baseline for maybe people who haven't had that. And what we do is we put the onus on our folks to look out for the next person. So when we send you someplace to get a job, you don't have to come back and thank us. We know you're happy. We're happy for you. What we need you to do is be a good employee. So when something opens up, your boss will come to you. If we help you find housing, great. We know you're happy. You don't have to come back and wash our car, but you do have to be a good tenant and a good neighbor and hold that door open for someone else. We think this is investment in community, getting people to look out not just for themselves, but for the next person coming along. Yeah. That's how this thing stays alive. That's how we've built this organization to now being staffed by 20 folks, 10 of whom were formerly incarcerated folks. And this gives our clientele like hope that things can really be different. Even those who know they're not going to live at Providence at the Heights, just the idea that this thing is being developed, and the only way it was developed was because there was so many other people who thought this was an idea whose time has come, and that it was worthy of the investment of millions of dollars to make it happen. That blows our clients' minds, and even mine, that people have entrusted this kind of opportunity to us, and we have to be successful. That's how we look at every opportunity we're given, because we know that there are some waiting on the sidelines to point a finger and say, see, I told you so. Mm-hmm. And we function, maybe it sounds like paranoia, but that's how we started out working, and that's how we continue today. Mm-hmm. And our hope is that this project and others like it that are being developed now would just be the impetus for other folks coming to feel the same way, that this is important, that there's no population that's excluded from the idea of health and well-being, that there's not a population that is unworthy of this kind of consideration. Mm-hmm. And that's what we hope to be a part of establishing.
That's great. So piggybacking on that idea, everybody is worthy, right? And deserving of having a stable, great quality house that they can call home, right? You've already talked about how each of you have a lot of support in each of your communities and engage in a lot of collaborations and have, allies that are backing you. I imagine the opposite is also true, that there is opposition that you've faced in each of your communities. Hassan, I know for a fact that for you, that's true with PATH. And I'm wondering what insights and lessons you've taken from that in talking to somebody that may not have that same vision of the world that you just talked about, Hassan. And what has worked for you in really dealing with the NIMBYism and the opposition that I'm sure all of you have in some way faced in each of your communities?
Well, actually, we were rocked to sleep by how smooth the process had gone. First application, tax credits, all of that kind of stuff. And then we walked into Planning and Zoning Commission in last July, and we had followed the city planners' advice and guidance every step of the way. We were just coming to ask for some waivers in regards to how much parking space we had. Instead, they allowed 22 neighbors in opposition to the project to speak. And we weren't prepared for that. It wasn't that forum, and it was horrible to sit there and listen to some often pretty vile kinds of things, but they weren't just talking about my clients, they were talking about me as well. And it was really difficult. And, we had community meetings where we gave the neighbors an opportunity to express their concerns and us to try to answer their questions. And I went through the summer feeling like the Bride of Frankenstein, with the torches and the pitchforks. But when it came to us appealing that decision to City Council in September, we had a ground game going for about 6 weeks prior, and we knocked 1,300 doors in the community. We ran a phone bank. We got 300 letters of support. And that night, the hearing took place. It was a 5.5-hour hearing, and we had about 200 people in the neighborhood that came out in support. And one of the things that we were able to do is talk to our neighbors and our supporters as well about what's common between our populations and not just the differences. And so what we found, too, is that many people, and I don't think there's a family in America that is excluded from this, has dealt with mental health issues, substance use disorder issues, trauma issues, and we wound up talking about those things in the common thread that linked us because of those things. And that kind of got people to, I think, expand their view of who it was that was trying to live in their neighborhood and be supported by folks who understood these issues.
Thanks.
Well, I can tell you it's a lot. The work, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's easier when you have, in my case, a mayor who was ready to provide cover. And honestly, there was probably a little earth got scorched in our process because, he just said if we need to have housing first principles and providers don't want to come along, then they don't get any funding. And so we were able to do things like that. But in particular with the Rescue Mission campus and the permanent supportive housing there, I think what interestingly about 20 years ago, there was a proposal for a similar campus, and the neighborhood opposed that and was able to quash the project. And having grown up in Colorado Springs and having studied community development, sociology, I had actually gone in there at that time and gone door to door and did a big research paper on what really were the opinions of the homeowners. And I found that the neighborhood wasn't actually that as opposed. It's just that the non-vocal ones didn't want to get on the outs with their neighbors. So anyway, long story short is when this happened again, when this came up, we knew that was going to be a place, we needed to build trust with those residents. And so, I had a history with a lot of them. So we went back in, we offered them, we need to do a preservation plan for your neighborhood. We need to do, what can we do to improve the sidewalks? What kind of services can this campus ultimately provide, such as like a health clinic that would benefit the people in that neighborhood? And by doing that and spending a significant amount of time, we came up with a good neighbor agreement. We were able to, there was no opposition when we went to Planning Commission. And previously there had been so much opposition that the project had been abandoned. So I think that's a really important piece. Now I will tell you that I took a real personal role in that, and then I left city government. And there are legitimate reasons to distrust the government in that neighborhood, and I felt like I sort of, in the end, contributed to that because I came in, said this is going to ultimately be a good thing, let's see how we can make it work, and then I left. And that's always a risk if you're not building that support internally for the people there to really lead the issue. So that's one.
Thank you. Very important insights. Eudelia, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a couple different pieces. So for me, I think I really saw with this new bill I was talking about earlier, 1309. Right, there had been other bills that had been presented before and had failed, and I think this one really made the change because it was. Community was so involved. Community feedback was so involved, and so I think there was. Right, from the owners of these manufactured home parks, there's going to be pushback as like, you just need to follow the rules, pay your fees, pay your rents. That's how they see it. And maybe trying to get them to see the other piece of like, when you have community involved, they're most likely to take care of whatever it is that you're building. Right now we're working on one park that is working on getting a play yard because a lot of these don't even have don't have access to outside recreation easily or play spaces. And so still working on that, trying to get them to meet us in the middle on some of that. And then I think the other piece with the residents themselves, it's fear. It's a big fear. People that live usually in manufactured home parks, like it was said earlier, Hispanic or Latinx, and are afraid of retaliation because it has happened before and there was nobody really watching that. Right. So, so gaining the community's trust is very, very important. Yeah. So I think that's been an advantage that I've had growing up in Lake County and living in these communities.
Great. So one more question. I think we have time for one or two more. So piggybacking a little bit on this idea of gaining community trust, right, and really bringing the voices of community into all of this process. I know that your role deals directly with health equity, and using that lens, really working intentionally to make sure that the voices of those who may not otherwise be at the table or be represented are really there. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what are some of the ways in which you do that and that you think have worked in your community?
Yeah, I really think the capacity building and leadership fostering that our organization does has played a big role in that area. Because yes, when you first start working in the community, people are like, can you just say this for me? Can you talk for me? And that's how you start in the beginning, but then slowly, it's really cool to see when we go to the Capitol and have the residents, I know Senator Donovan, I'll feel comfortable talking to her and advocating on something. So I think those two things may be helping in the beginning, and then, okay, how can we work together and keep watering that seed to build that leadership.
Great.
So that when we're not there anymore, the residents can keep doing it on their own.
Right. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, in hindsight, with the work that I did with the city of Colorado Springs, I think that when the cities have very specific roles, and I do believe the leadership is important, setting vision, providing resources, using the bully pulpit when they need to, helping to build capacity. But I will say that I think one of the sort of challenges that we had was that, it sort of got attached to me, some of the work that was going on at the time. And the city became the center of the focus of the work. And really, we need to be building that, putting our providers and putting the people that we serve as the focus, and not having just the one public champion. Public champions are very important. But what happened was, you changed leadership. So we had a different mayor who had a very different opinion. The city sends mixed messages. On one hand, here I am talking about building housing and providing opportunity. And then the other side of the city, we're out displacing people in in camps, and I'm having to defend that policy. I'm having to go up and speak against a homeless Bill of Rights, and I think it's very, very inconsistent. So, I did this from a personal place. There was I had this sort of missionary zeal for public service and really wanted to represent folks, but. In retrospect, really, we should have spent more time building that, building the public will, and not just depending on the cover that was being provided at the time by a very visionary mayor. So I think that's a really important thing for cities and neighborhoods to recognize. Don't let the city be the focus of your efforts.
Thank you.
Well, if I could, I'm sitting here thinking about a gentleman in a much smaller audience than this. He came to me after a presentation and he asked, how could myself, Sean Taylor, our deputy director, and Adam Abdullah, our mentoring coordinator, how we could have done so much time in prison and still come out with all our marbles. When I say he's an old guy, I'm whited out, so he had to be dusty. But only thing I could say to him was that, it's what I believe, that the reason we were allowed to return to this world is to do exactly what we're doing. And I want to encourage people, because sometimes what needs to be done seems to be so monumental, and you don't even know if it's possible to achieve the end, and that sometimes prevents people from getting started. And I just want to encourage folks who have these big, hairy, audacious goals to not be intimidated or overwhelmed by them. I spent many, many years. I started using drugs at age 5, and I'm in my 30th year of recovery now. But I'm a hope fiend, an active hope fiend, and I'm encouraged every day by the things that I see, including this gathering. We had Governor Polis come to Second Chance Center and sign 9 pieces of legislation last month, criminal justice reform legislation, and we were only involved in 3 pieces of that legislation. And that was the most encouraging part for me, that we weren't involved in 6 of those laws.
Yep.
And there was a time when there wasn't a space for us, and we had to carve our own space. And as a result of it, we cracked the door, and other people have joined this effort. And for those of you who have been involved for sometimes decades trying to get to an end, understand what's happening around you right now. The conversation is broadening, okay? And the ranks are thickening with people who are skilled, who are impassioned, and who are dedicated to getting the same kind of things done you think you've been operating in a silo to get done. It really isn't like that, and we should be encouraged. We should be encouraged to go after those big, hairy, audacious goals, and that's what I want to leave with folks today. So.
Thank you. We only have about 2 minutes left, but I wonder if very quickly I could ask Amy and Udilia to tell us what makes you hopeful. Hassan has already shared his about this work and all of us collectively moving forward with it.
What makes, I'm sort of a hoping machine too, right? So, and you got to keep the hoping machine running. What I'm hopeful about is really the amount of research and data. And I know that you can't rely on that. This is not necessarily a technical problem, right? We've cracked the code. We know housing and services works. But it's really that adaptive piece, that leadership piece, where we've got to use that to change hearts and minds, because you can confront with a lot of data, but unless people feel committed to this, they'll always come back with some sort of opinion or sort of ideological position or moral position. But I am very heartened by the amount of research, the amount of storytelling that people are getting to speak and tell their own stories. And I think that will help carry this message, because again, I think we've largely cracked the code of what is needed, but we have to make that other human connection and help people learn how to be uncomfortable and adjust their attitudes and behaviors. And I see a lot of that happening.
Thank you.
I think for me in the work that I do in the communities that I work with, also the leadership piece and getting, fostering that leadership, especially amongst the communities of color leadership into, we have a coalition, Líderes Latinas, and it was really cool to hear about talking about school board elections coming up. And I don't know that we've had many people of color sit on our school board. So it was cool to hear like, oh, you're running? You know what? I think I'm going to run too. Yeah, I'm going to do it. So that keeps me hopeful. Like, yes, let's work together and get us up there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What better way to end this, right? Please help me thank the panelists. All right, I have just a couple of instructions as we move to lunch. Please pick up a sack lunch and head to a session or to lunch on your own. And the sessions are actually being projected on the screen. And then after lunch, join us back here at 12:30 for Matthew Desmond. Thank you. Have a wonderful lunch.